Welcome. Thank you very much, Adam, for this nice introduction. So I hope I can bring you through 30 years of research with a few slides. Some are more or less complex, but you don't have to understand them. I want to guide you through, and I would also like to point to some mechanism which I think are important for the treatment of particular of depression. There's so many ideas about using psychedelics in medicine for all kinds of illnesses, from depression to trauma patients to personality disorders. But so far we have only evidence, recent evidence at least, from depression. So, but I don't want to go too much into the clinical application. I tried to give you a little bit insight how difficult it also is to come out with so-called biomarkers, with functions that may be altered in depression, and how we can regulate or reinstate them with psychedelics. So my first slide just wants to show that psychedelics alter many domains of the psyche, and it's always difficult to say which one is the most important, particularly for the use of psychedelics in patients. But I would like to start with the self-ego. I call it matrix because there is no self and no ego in the brain. The ego or self matrix is a structure, a very flexible structure that enables a feeling of we are a person, we have a body, we have feelings, and it's all tied together. It's nothing loose. So it's a perspective on ourselves. When we use psychedelics, this perspective can be distorted in different ways. Then psychedelics also alter perception. I don't go in perception research. We did a lot of studies to find biological mechanism that may underlie visual alterations and symbolic imagery, which is certainly not really treated good in psychiatry, because most of people think they're just an epiphenomenon of the effects of psychedelics. But I personally think they tell a lot about the patient's story and his memories. Altered mode of thinking. Psychedelics can bring you from classical, I would say, higher-ordered cognitive processes to primary process thinking, like psychoanalysts have defined in the past. And we did studies looking at this kind of processes, intuitions, and getting insight. And the other thing what Catherine Prell talked about, it's what she is quite interested in, is the connection between altered emotion processing and social cognition that is also affected with psychedelics. So what is the problem? The problem is that we got information from people through verbal reports, or when they express in art. Sometimes they make pictures in our sessions, or they have even the task to produce some pictures of what they experience. And we have the brain as a correlate. So the interaction of the subjective, first person perspective, that's the basis. So I start with the psyche, and we look correlates to psychological experiences. Most of neuroscientists start with the brain. They think, let's start the brain and think how this may lead to subjective effects. But I'm a little bit a friend of the thought, like my long friend Giulio Tononi is going as a consciousness researcher. It may be more realistic to study structures in the experience and look how are isomorphic structures in the brain. So that's another approach than normally people go. So I wanted to speak a little bit about neural correlates of the self, then the role of attention. It's very important. Emotion regulation, acceptance and decentering. And the third question is very important. There is more and more research going on now with psychedelics, not in the academia or in clinical research. There's also a lot of companies going into the field. And the basic tenor is there. The whole experience is not really important. It's just a mechanism that is touched unconsciously in the brain, and that's enough. We don't need the experience. So there are more and more papers about that stuff now. So when we started in the 90s, we started with psilocybin, MDMA. Later then we used LSD, but we also studied a lot of amphetamines and certainly also medications, because I was heavily involved in schizophrenia research. And what we showed already in 98, we had a little bit evidence before, that 2A antagonists, here is placebo, here is psilocybin, and we give a dose of a 2A antagonist that brings down almost the whole experience, what we could measure with psychedelics, and a larger dose brings it completely down. The leftovers were some tiny cognitive effects we could not block, like attention, effect on attention. On the other hand, if we worked on the serotonin 1A receptor, 1A, there's 1A, B, C, 1A, that has an inverse effect on the 2A. 2A activation leads to the psychedelic experience here. But when we manipulate other serotonin receptors, we still could bring down the visual effects, but nothing else. So that's also an interesting approach. Nowadays, we do a lot of animal research because LSD also activates dopamine receptors and other receptors. I don't want to make it too complex here, but you see the profile is quite different. DMT particularly interacts with 1A, 1B, and 2A in a different way than psilocybin. That leads a little bit to another profile. But basically, we could say psychedelics are, at least to a large part, or induce their psychological effects through activation of this receptor. This receptor has been cloned, isolated, one knows a lot about this. And if the receptor gets activated in a cell, there are many downstream effects here, which I don't want to go into that. But there's one important question, which we also study. Why is serotonin, who activates 2A receptors, 1A, 6, 7, not psychedelic? This question is not solved yet. We have a lot of ideas. If the 2A receptor is activated and we have downstream effects in the cell on second messengers, that there are differences here. So that's just to give you a little bit insight in the complexity. That's a different duration of the psychedelics, and with the duration of the psychedelics, the occupancy in the brain of the 2A receptor goes in parallel. So most of the 2A activation leads to specific activation of different cells in the cortex and in subcortical regions. So what you heard about, a lot about neuroplasticity, if you take psychedelics, or more and more works. That's a very new research that could add more since the last 2-3 months, that spines start to grow, and it's still discussed whether more neurons are made through psychedelics. It doesn't look like that. It looks more that the connections between the neurons is enhanced and modified very fast in our animals within 3 hours. It's not a day after or 3 days after, at least in mice. And if we knock out the receptor, you can knock out the 2A receptor in animals. We can't do that in humans. In humans, we block it, but the knockout model is certainly much more detailed into the molecular steps of these drugs. But what is the problem? We don't know exactly. Glutamate is released if you activate the 2A receptor, and that leads to an activation of glutamatergic receptors. So it is not possibly unique that you activate the 2A receptor. You can manipulate the glutamate release with many other compounds, and what you can do is, for instance, with ketamine. Ketamine increases glutamate. Now glutamate goes up, activates the AMPA receptor. That leads to increase of BDNF, a neurotropic factor, and through an mTOR mechanism, which that would be a lot of details here, activates this neuroplasticity. the glutamate release activates NMDA and activates learning. So particularly in brain regions, we know a lot about learning and memory. So what the industry is doing, they skip the 2A receptor and work on this system, which is obviously, if you start to understand neuroplasticity. The question is neuroplasticity important for the acute effects, or is it important for the long-term effects? We don't know. In animals, it's not shown that the manipulation really of the glutamate system and this receptor systems and the neuroplasticity is linked to the behavioral alterations. We have only one study, and now a second study, that shows some links, but this is not established yet. But we're working on this. Just that you get a little bit an idea about this neuroplasticity and the complexity of psychedelic research. Now, in the 70s, I met Leiner in the 80s, late 80s. Hans-Karl Leiner, a German psychotherapist and physiologist who worked 30 years with LSD and wrote for me the most best comprehensive overviews about how psychedelic may work. And he said very simple things like there's a kind of regression in cognitive overview of yourself, regression in the way you think, going back to a more primary way of thinking, like psychoanalysts like to talk about it, less rational, more animated, more emotionally, more insight. And the most important, he could tease out of hundreds of patients. Unfortunately, the best thing he wrote in German, not in English, so people don't know so much about Leiner, was the activation of the emotional system and a change how people process emotion. That's not the same. You can increase emotion, being in a good mood, doesn't mean that you deal different with anxious stimuli or mood-enhancing stimuli. That's the questions we went into in a number of studies. I said symbolic thinking. How does the psyche translate affective or cognitive experience into symbols? Only humans can do that because we have language. Symbolic thing is language dependent. It's very important to study the patient, not just behaviorally from brain scanning, but to get real insight in the dynamics of his feelings and thinking. That's you can learn from Leiner. If you read this famous book he wrote, a 200-300 pages book about the regression of the psyche, alteration of emotion, I think it's still valid. But this was what our starting points for hypothesis to look into things. Now, I want to go now a little bit through the meditation study. Why did we do that? Meditation means that the word meditation from Sanskrit, coming from Bhavanua or Guam, means to become familiar with, to cultivate. It's a process. It's not something, it's a skill you can train. And the most important, I think, and talking to many experienced meditation teachers, and it's a heightened state of awareness and focused attention. That's what you go through in meditation training as a novice, and you get a real training, be here now. Out of that, we looked into this attentional thing because Leiner wrote, if people got a too high dose of psychedelics, he had a few control studies on 150 depressed patients, which he had not published well, but we have the data. It shows if patients get too confused, they don't have much profit of the psychedelic experience. Having attention inward is, and mastering that is important, that you can overview what's going on and you can report that stuff. So meditation, there are different forms. And I don't have time now to go into meditation stuff really, but what I want to say is the novice start with attentional training, getting into meta-awareness, what's going on in my psyche, observing your own psyche. That's the concentration approach. Focused attention. And our Zen Buddhists first started with focused attention. That's a little training for a few minutes. And then they go into open meditation, which is more taking a perspective on your emotional flow, your cognitive flow, your whole inner experience, observe that, and use a non-judgmental stance. Don't judge yourself. Maybe you give them a new value, the experience. That's a reappraisal. And the forms are called compassion, meditation, loving kindness. And then there's the next step of kind of going deeper in meditation from the non-judgmental awareness and acceptance to unmasking the deception of the ego. And that is something I really learned from highly respected people I met in meditation retreats, that this is the most, should I say, challenging aspect, so-called insight meditation leading to emptiness. And insight means that your ego, who structures you in space and time and in personality, the so-called I, me, gets, you inquire that existence, that permanence, you say, you realize it's constructed, it's learned since the first 2-3 months, from starting from a baby to the adultness, how you build up this structure of ego. And breaking that down is what these Zen Buddhists, that's the goal, to get loss of this rigidity of this psychological structure. So, because we have known that psychedelics have a little bit the same goal, to get insight, and emptiness means here not being in a voice. Emptiness means you haven't getting insight, everything goes through the ego structured, and you go beyond that, and suddenly you have an experience. It's not nothingness. Emptiness is not nothingness, it's empty of this structure. Now, I said, we know from mindfulness training in patients and in normal beings that increasing attention capacity leads to changes in wellness. In the end, deconstruction of egocentricity. So the question was for the retreat: does psilocybin lead to a deeper experience compared to the placebo? Certainly, placebo could be detected. Do we have certain predictors of positive and negative aspects of ego dissolution? How mindfulness impacts the meditation depths, and mindfulness impacts are these predictors? The second important thing we could nicely rate psychologically is the regulation strategy they use. But then we want to know, is there a correlate in the brain that leads to this self-reference? And in the end, does a single dose of psilocybin in meditation experts lead to post-acute psychological alterations? Because we thought, and they know what's reality. Can they have a benefit of that? We didn't know, so that was one of the questions. These were the expert studies going on now with beginners, so we have to compare or to control the expert knowledge versus the beginners. So you have seen that there were 4 retreats with each group had 5 and 5 placebo and 5 psilocybin. The doses were between 22 to 27 based on body weight. We have done fMRI, and the other groups we do is online EEG during sitting. This is more complex with Wi-Fi, having all the brain wiring stuff here is much more challenging technically. We have a lot of very nice people in the group, and certainly Vanya, who is guiding the people through the retreat. The retreat is very, for experts, very challenging in terms of sitting, daily practice, morning 6:30 to the evening, with a break. It's silent, no talking, a week long, walking meditation, sitting meditation, that's the whole plan. But everything is published. I don't want to go in these details, but that you see it was very structured. So to the design, tease out a few potential predictors we had known from studying the literature and what we have done in healthy subjects. We looked at personality measures, these things, optimism towards life, age. Then we had other things like trait mindfulness, then the emotion regulation strategy they used. We had all rated that with different special scales before, did fMRI, and then we rated them every day. And also meditation depths and mindfulness, there are different scales. We rated the whole along the retreat, and we used these values here as predictors together with this. And that was the outcome, the 5D ALPS set or 11D ALPS set and the mystical rating scales. And then after the retreat, another fMRI, post-acute measures of medication depths, is the impact of psychedelics on meditation later on. And finally, we looked at the changes in behavior 4 and 6 months later. So the question is that battery of assessments, does it tell something about who might have a good trip, a good response? And does this battery of measures say anything about the change later? This is published, well known. We can assess oceanic boundlessness through specific scales. Dietrich has developed over 10 years, modified and modified. We still modify it. And these are dimensions of oceanic boundlessness. There's a sum score, but you can look at loss of ego boundaries, insightfulness, experience of unity, deeply felt positive mood, disembodiment. So this is what goes with oceanic boundlessness. And on the other hand, people who do more studies into religion uses mystical scales, a number of well-established scales from Hood, for instance, which we used. They got the total score, and what we found that these things go hand in hand. It's not the same, but it goes in parallel. So mystical scale has an extrovertive mysticism that is a feeling of unity, looking outside in the world, being connected. Introversion is more the loss of these boundaries and the space-time changes, which we have here also. And interpretation is already a psychological phenomenon after mystical experience. How was it positively in emotion? So it's not a primary experience, it's how you think about it. Positive sacredness, is it sacred, which you can go in long debates now. How much is the sacred experience an emotional experience? And noetic quality means insight. So then we have certainly the visual stuff and the anxious ego dissolution. And the question we had is certain mechanism in the center this may foster this experience and hamper the development of anxiety. In fact, what we saw over the days, meditation depths goes on in the placebo group, goes on in the psychedelic group, but here we had a little peak. It was not very significant, but what was more, sorry, this was mindfulness. The medication depth goes significantly much deeper and stays on after day 5, 6, and 7. So it goes on like this, and this certainly it doesn't go much higher. But this is typically the learning, like everything you repeat, you learn. You take a placebo several times, you may have better effects. You take a psychedelic several times, it may go with learning. So what you see here is the placebo group in terms of blissfulness, and here the psilocybin group. There are large differences. They go up to 70% of the scale maximum. To mention is that the Buddhists, the trained ones, had much less, almost no impairment of control and of cognitive functions and attentional. They had a little bit of decrease of attentional capacity, but not the same like what we see in normal volunteers. They also had nothing of complex imagery. Even they had psychedelics, had much less. And they had a lot of elementary stuff. That was the difference. But what was interesting that almost all of the people who got psilocybin were about the cutoff level from Roland Griffiths to have a mystical experience. he says it's about 100 of the scale. We had almost 3 placebo subjects who had that also. And if you compare this 3 with that, we could not differentiate that experience by these scales we used here. So that's interesting. That the result shows that you don't need a drug, but these are very experienced people. So what was more interesting is that after the retreat on day 6 and 7, the depth, how deep meditation goes, the trait change, people with psychedelics showed even a better capacity to go into this mindfulness state, and this is similar like people have reported after ayahuasca. And here is just to show that is the retreat group with psilocybin, that is the placebo group. This is, yes, a placebo group, and this is the same dose in the laboratory. You see that the environment up there in the retreat center gives quite a different shape through a number of measures, and it's quite stronger than we do the same in the lab. So it's quite an influence of the environment. Now, when we go to the predictors, we found a number of predictors that we hypothesized before, like absorption, capacity, leads globally to a change, but particularly to oceanic boundlessness. Optimism was fostering that experience. These were mathematical regression analysis and path analysis if you're interested in the mathematics, but you can look into the publication. Then the trait, mindfulness, how their capacity to accept what's going on was very important for the oceanic boundlessness. On the other hand, emotional reappraisal, how they can reapprise the experience, was buffering the negative experience. And this was the only marker or only psychological effect we found. How could the trained people buffer the negative? Most of the capacity, the capacity to descend before the retreat, day 3 instead of day 4 where they got the drug, meditation depths, they fostered more the oceanic boundlessness. Certainly, having drug or not drug has the strongest effect of the development of these experiences. Now, 4 months after, we were, as said, surprised that the psilocybin group had such strong alterations compared to the placebo group in important variables. We looked at different ratings. I take one here, and one is very nice appreciation of life. And for me, it was interesting to see self-acceptance still can go up in this kind of people. Being less worldly oriented, less materialistic, made a little, it's a tendency, it's a trend here. And spirituality, there was also only trend like, so we don't do a lot of that. But apprehension of death was very interesting, that these people said they went through their breakdown of the ego and having less fear of death. Again, they made a progress after this time. Now, are there neural correlates? Yes, they are. So we know a lot about frontal areas in the parts of the default network and posterior areas of the default network. These areas are more linked to social interactions. These are more linked to how we think about ourselves, self-referential processing in the frontal areas, anterior cingulate. There are other regions, but we take just these 2 out, and what we see, the stronger the trip was, the more the communication between frontal areas and posterior areas are dissociated. They are not lost, but they are loosened. That's maybe the better word. It goes down. And this loosening of this connectivity of frontal and posterior areas that are responsible for self-referential processing goes with the change of the persistent effects. Just here, 2 rating scales. It was really tough. We didn't expect that it has such a strong effect. Now we did more mathematical models. Who is driving that change? And take just one out because there's a lot of speculation, and we have here in this analysis 60 subjects. We added more data. The feeling of unity, which is a sub-dimension of extrovertive mysticism, leads particularly to self-acceptance. This ego loss everybody's talking about, with introvertive mysticism, certainly in this Buddhistic month is already almost gone, adds little to the self-acceptance. It's more the feeling of being connected. We take another one. Appreciation of life was driven particularly by positive affects, sacredness, this path, and in addition read the positive effects. So you can look into the paper and look at all these maps, but what I wanted to show here is not the details of the study, but we can bring down more and more what might add to changes. And one thing is important, emotion regulation is important. It's not just this lesson, this feeling of unity. This is not the whole story. And if you work with, all of you, all the therapists know that if you work with depressed patients, emotion is more in the foreground than the ego. Even depressed patients have a loss, maybe of an important person, which they suffer from. So we come to the story of depression. Depression is still defined based on a number of symptoms you have. And from a more functional aspect, we try to define depression more from cognitive processes. For instance, increased self-focus is important. Think about yourself. We call it rumination, grübeln in Deutsch. It's a negative attentional cognitive aspect. It's a bias. You always attract to the negative. Then you have negative self-attribution. You have a negative emotional bias. If you show patients negative pictures, angry faces, the brain reacts much more to this than to the happy faces. So this is cognitive processing is self-centered. Emotions are self-centered. Environmental interactions are reduced. So here, are reduced, and increased body experiences are often in psychosomatic symptoms in depressed patients. So we have a lot of theoretical models and experiences from patients. We can detailed study what psychedelics do. So this is a hell, this slide. I just want to I showed it just, I thought take it out. But I show it for the psychoanalysis, or people that are more into that stuff. Ego self-matrix is a functional aspect of the psyche. It's something that flows over the unconsciousness, pre-consciousness, here comes the consciousness. That's an organizational structure. Freud thought one of the functions is defense, inhibiting, mediator of drive regulation, mastering tension, supervisor, the reality ego. There's so many stories about this and good data, but it's hard to bring this kind of language into neurocognitive science. Still, we try. And the most important is the synthetic function of the ego, to integrate different aspects of your drive. You fight with problems, mostly unconsciously. How can you study that? It's difficult. So we go to more newer aspect of psychoanalytical dynamic thinking, that you say, this is the functional aspect of the ego. Let's go to what we can maybe measure, the representation of the ego. The ego represented as I, affectively, viscerally, as a body, cognitively, as abstract, your belief system, or your emotional experiences. This is representation and self-representation. That means you are in a flow of experiences, and now you make a loop and look at you, what's going on emotionally, socially, with my ego, and so on. So we try to come up with ideas in neuroscience to look at these mechanisms. Self-representation as an agent. Agency is a quality of the ego. Mindness, authorship are fundamental aspects of an ego. And then you have the self as object representation for the psychoanalyst, again, the significant others, internalized, and the fights between these things. So let's forget it. It's nice to have, and it's a whole story for itself. How can we go from psychodynamic, classical thinking to more neurocognitive thinking about the self? Now we go into one simple experiment, because there's a lot of ideas that the body self, the experience through touch, builds up the very, very basic in babies. Up 2, 3, 4 months, they start to play with the body, with the fingers and so, and that this tactile sensory input builds up predictions, and it goes up to regions in the brain that are important for sensory processing. Then time by time you build up an expectation top down from the cortex that these both level interfere with each other. You make predictions about the world, and you have sensory input, and that this is coded somehow in the neural processing. And we started with a simple thing, the body self. Can we look with psychedelic how the body experience as, let's say, the basis or one of the evolutionary one of the basis, because this tactile differentiation, me versus others, is also certainly going on in animals. It's not cognitive controlled like in our human experiences. So sensory input going through the hierarchy of a lot of processes get always a prediction quasi feedback to the different levels of processing. And if the expectation, how something of the sensory input comes in, misses, we think a prediction error is constructed. Also the discrepancy between predicted and the natural incoming bottom-up content of procedures produce a prediction error, a prediction signals. That's something we can experimentally approach. So behind this is that the brain learns to model and predict incoming sensory input to minimize the surprise across multiple levels of processing and representations, for instance, visual or body perception. This is what's going on, sensory perception. You have learned already that this may mean this and that. You make predictions. And you know, Carl Harris or Robin has suggested the prediction error processing is disturbed, but nobody has measured that. So we said, let's measure that. So we used a paradigm where we give tactile stimuli in a certain series of stimulus, and then we have a deviant, a deviation. We gave double pulses or stronger pulses. So that is, if you have this, you start to learn that, and you think here, oh, the next will be the same. No, after 3, 4 pulses, you anticipate, you expect it has to be the same. But if you have a deviant, you get surprised, yeah? And then you go on here, then you go down. So that's the whole paradigm. And with each trial, you certainly can measure the brain, what's going on. And we measured it with fMRI, functional fMRI, and EEG, because EEG is much faster. We go into the millisecond range. When we do that with normal persons, we got a very nice matrix of activated areas that include frontal areas in the frontal cortex, the cingulate, primary sensory motor cortex, insula, and certainly the thalamus here, which Catherine spoke about, the sensory inputs through the thalamus to these cortical areas. So we can look what's going on if the prediction fails, and what are the areas that are responsible for generating this prediction error. So what we found is that psilocybin reduces the establishing or the full formation of the predictions and associated with frontal areas as we expected very strongly, and with sensory areas. And in the EEG we found the very same. We saw that frontal areas that underlie the measurements, this prediction error construction, are disrupted. I can say disrupted or less established. And the nice thing is that we cannot influence that. This is not rated verbally. This is a construct, a theoretical construct. But it really nicely correlates with measures people report. After each trial, we reported them, disembodiment and feeling of unity. That means that theoretical concept and constructs to a feeling of ego, which is really hard to go into without verbal reports, we can come on into this kind of theories through measurements of how we constantly predict something. Maybe that you better understand this prediction is if you hear a melody, da da da, you would say da is the next because it's Beethoven's fifth. So you expect that da 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 da, this next tone you expect, it's in your memory, it's in your past, you have learned that, and that's what we do. It comes something else, and that is surprise, and the brain is hungry of surprises. We could it also do with taking people's own voice. We did a voice shift. We gave them a feedback. They had to produce little syllables, very simple things like ba and la and poo. And we feedbacked that very fast. This is an EEG study, which even much faster than fMRI takes 2 seconds to measure. Here we speak about milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, so one we can measure. And we give a feedback of the own voice, the self, very fast, and we shifted that feedback. We we changed the pitch so that people thought, oh, it's not my own voice. You realize that, yes? Or we switch it into a female voice, or a male into the female, and in another voice. And what happened here is exactly the same frontal areas that detect our own voice, my ownership, it's my voice, that's an aspect of the ego, is disrupted, and very nicely including structures in the insula and temporal cortices, also really like a lot of imaging study showed to. Psilocybin modulates that detection of our own voice, of our ownership. It's brought down, and again, that was surprising. It was correlating with feelings of unity, but here also with changed meaning of percepts. The meaning of this percepts wasn't the same, but makes sense. But what you see, what we learn about this is that the mapping towards an ego, not rated verbally, converges. Now, yeah, the last thing. Do I have some minutes? Okay. Because I never look at the watch, sorry. The last thing is, which is important for the psychologist here, is, are the subjective effects of psychedelic necessary for lasting beneficial changes? Olson is just printing out a number of patients which I've seen. They think it's not important. Now, yeah. All that work, 30 years for nothing. Then my good friend and first Oberassistent, Scott Thompson, at the Brain Research Institute, where I started my research in mice, also is challenging us. He says, we see the whole behavioral effects also with catanserin when it blocks the 2A receptors. Why do we need the psyche? And there's other papers coming out, just another one in a PNS paper, and now a Cell paper is coming out. Apparently in animals you can block the 2A receptor, and they behave nicely in terms of antidepressant-like effects. There are two challenging questions. Did they really give enough of catanserin? Is the mice behavior a measure for humans? I doubt, because it's maybe in the emotion regulation, but not in the cognitive control of emotion. Mice have no frontal cortex. So, but we have other arguments. I'm really interested in the non-conscious emotion processing aspects of psychedelics. And I show here one study. It's not a new one. We did a number of studies, but this is one I really like. So we show pictures because, social interaction, emotions are important. Happiness, neutral, fearful, phases. These are little videos, 20 millisec to 100 millisec. We expand them. When we give them very fast, people look here, and then they look to the, I don't know what that is. The inbuilt automatic psychedelic manipulation of my story. So, how we start? You give it an angry face or anxious. My God, this is not nice. Just 10 millisec, you know, that's flashing in. So people cannot say what they have seen. And then you give a mask to block the process. And then you ask them, button press, was it fearful? Was it happy? Was it neutral? Fixation point again. There's a series of pictures you give in the scanner or in the EEG. Then you give another target and you give it longer, the happy face, 200 millisec. Then people see it. Then they have to give the mask to stop the process of this processing. If you put in a mask, then you stop that process. And you ask again, and so on. And we did that, I think each picture or each constant 80 times. You need a lot of data. And what you see, that psilocybin unconsciously, as the mask, get manipulated. The experience of fearful reactions goes down, neutral not, unhappy also not. They are not identical, but this is science. This is statistically not different, but this is different. By the way, we did it also with ketamine, but there's another story. But when you do it consciously, look at this. The fearful modulation of fearful experiences, not aware of, but your brain reacts to fearful states, less than normal. And here consciously it's much more modulated, neutral not, and the happy also not. If you ask me what's the difference between, because we had this ketamine stories this morning, ketamine also blocked the happy faces. So important difference between psilocybin and ketamine. Ketamine only blocked out the negative faces, and quite strongly. So with this, I just wanted to bring your attention to the question, is the psyche needed? Certainly the psyche is needed. As I said in the beginning, attention capacity help us, therefore we have it, to navigate through the world. So everybody learning is very dependent on attention capacity. And this is learning with psychedelics. More details, how these networks modulate, but in the center of this modulation, we certainly have the amygdala, which is down-modulated. We know from Fred Barrett that, yes, good here. There's long changes between frontal area and amygdala for 1 month in healthy controls. We don't know yet in patients, really. So let's get out. The other thing is imagery, which I wanted just to make my conclusions here, that a lot of our patients and healthy subjects, after we have measured them, we never do experiments more than 30 to 40 minutes. They have a scanning, they have an EEG, but the rest, they are, they can do what they want, but a lot of people like to draw or to rest, listen to music. And it's interesting how constant certain things like channels or tunnels pop up. This was a very interesting biologist. He had stories about evolution and so, or birth, rebirth, the death and the rebirth, the embryo and the flowers, like a Chinese cultural impact here. So there's a lot of going on, or here a very strange animal. What is going on with the visions? And I think the vision and all the symbolic thinking is also very important, so we have no clinical data about the impact of that. So in sum, I want to say attention is important. I could show you a lot of experiments how attention modulates memory, learning and executive function, also decision making on these things. Mindfulness meditation can support towards a positive ego dissolution. Emotion regulation is also important, how people regulate their emotion. the psychedelics can, through self-dissolution, promote lasting beneficial effects. It was a very good predictor, particularly the feeling of unity and positive emotion. Sacredness was positive for the social outcome. Yeah, and the impact of challenging emotions on the outcome warrants further studies. We have just completed a study in depression with 60 patients, and we have the feeling, preliminary feeling, that going through the challenging emotions is also very important in depression, at least in depression. It's not just the positive experience of self-loss. Thank you very much for your attention.
So now let's go with our last round of questions.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for your presentation. I have a question related to the unconscious. I'm here. Bah, je pense que... So, I'm here.
Oh, hi. This light is so delighting.
So I had a question related to the study with the masks and the processing of fearful faces.
Yeah.
Because you were linking that somehow to blocking of the 2A receptors, if I understood well.
That's the primary mechanism, yeah, that you block 2A, and then this is not, if we give ketanthrin, we lose it, yes, but this is tautology, because we activate it, we block it, there's nothing going on in that domain, in the emotional domain, yes.
Yeah, so the fact that the masked image are still decreased, the processing of the fearful masked image is still decreased, has nothing to do with the theory that by blocking the 2A receptors you can still get the effect.
We haven't checked that out in this experiment, I can't say. We would have to give ketanthrin, and then you still have an unconscious effect. Then we would know it, yes.
Right.
That's the conclusion. Okay. So you have to do the same experiment, give them a blocker, we block the 2A. Maybe there's still some 1A, 5 or other receptors involved, and we still have a reduction of the negative phases. Yes, that's the idea.
Okay,
you have to do that experiment.
So thank you for your presentation, and I have to say the film was also really beautiful.
Thank you.
If I understood well, in your study, there wasn't a big difference in hallucination between the people taking psilocybin and the placebo group in meditation people?
There was only the placebo group also had this very elementary visual alterations, popping up lights, cobwebs, these geometric things they can have. Not everybody, but they had it also relatively strongly for a short period. It's well known in Zen meditation that people, when they go into deeper and deeper in this state, they go through this visual stuff which they don't care a lot. But they hadn't had this complex scenery hallucinations like the psilocybin.
So that explained why there's not a big difference between the two groups? Or
there's only in the visual stuff there's some... You can say it the other way around. Even they had no psychedelics, they had some geometric pattern-like experience.
Okay, so it's not that the group with psilocybin had less vision. It was more that the meditation group had already a practice in it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I just following on from that last comment, I was wondering last night as I was watching the film if you had actually, among the experimental group of meditators, a large number of people who had previous psychedelic experiences, or if they were all neophytes in the matter,
Good question.
and if there was any difference between the reactions.
Now, in this group, we had 8 subjects that had 10 years ago the last psychedelic experience, less than 3. That was one of the problems to get. It's really hard to get subjects in studies that had no experience. But the cutoff was not, of the first 40, there were only these 8 that had 10 years before less than 3 trials. And yeah, it's really hard. It's also hard with other people. Almost everybody had some experience. So but we have done a number of studies in healthy subjects. Really, there's nothing. But also here, it's important to control. Yes, what we thought 10 years, maybe, yeah, it's gone.
And did you find that made any difference? The fact that there was a large...
The contrast, you cannot statistically take it out. There are people that publish studies with 12 subjects. That's not my thing. You cannot take out of 40. This doesn't make any sense. You can look at this, what we certainly have done, but you cannot make groups. There's no significance. But 8 is so small. I wouldn't dare to say anything about 8. But it's certainly a very important question, previous experience. But we see that with the beginners, because that's the reason this studies goes very slow, to find beginners with no experience. Because often people have an experience and start meditation, and the other way around. It's not so easy. But certainly. But I think, if you had once the experience, it may help that you guide better through the next experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question on how long approximatively do you think that this method and these discoveries will be launched on the market for normal psychotherapy practice? Like, when will they replace or not our old antidepressants?
Wow. They will nothing replace, first of all. This is an add-on to what we have, because so far, if you have a really clear view on the psychedelic development of the research, it goes slow. The only study that is big is the COMPASS study, which know more or less how it works, because they have consulted me sometimes. It is a phase 2 study. Then the phase 3 study will take about 3 to 5 years normally, coming with 300 to 500 subjects. And if you want to do a registration study, this is all academic stuff. That's not registration study. Registration study means that you have to have a broad view on depression, and you cannot say, this patient may not be useful for the study, this may not be. The exclusion criteria have to be quite broad, that the registration office thinks it's valid to study that mechanism, like psychedelics, in depression. Because if you come up with a very small group, and it's even risky, then you have no chance.
But so we're speaking about 15, 20 years?
No, I think if COMPASS is pushing the stuff, then COMPASS will maybe ready 5-6 years. I think that could be really realistic. But after the phase 3 study, you have to go on a phase 4 study. That means you collect all the side effects, all the difficult things, and then the decision is made whether you get to the market or not. Up to phase 3 is all is open. And I have been involved in studies, phase 3, and the company thought, oh wow, now we go out. And then the phase 4 showed too many side effects on the long run. The more people you study, that's statistics, the more side effects you detect. It's very simple.
Okay, thank you very much.
It will be really hard, and you have to see if you come up with a specific complex psychotherapeutic intervention, that's not very wise. Then you have to test all the different combinations of drug effects and psychological effects and the interaction. That no registration office knows that. You go for antidepressants, we give them every day, straightforward. But if you come and say, you have to survive, you have to supervise this, you have introduction, you have to test all these things, and that takes, it's an enormous task, you cannot do that. You have to keep it simple, and therefore, it's a pity, but I think the pharmaceutical companies, like people I know in Japan, in New York, they go straight forward. They want to give like ketamine, psychedelics, a nice day, next please. It's disturbing. It disturbs me. I don't like it. But this is how compounds are registered. It's a pharmacological thing. It's sad, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Here.
Other side.
Other side, here.
Ah, nice.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the talk. And I have a question. During the retreat, were the meditators instructed to keep the practice, in the sense that also when they had some effect, they put the attention not on the effect itself, but on the meditation practice? In this way, they could also influence maybe the intensity of some effects. And I was wondering, like...
This was it's in the publication you can see that the day was very structured. Up to 9 o'clock in the evening, they went to bed and didn't talk, so we were quite isolated. They have eaten together, did some housework, because the meditation center, just the meditation center, is the locality where we keep them housing. You know, it was a hotel, but belongs to the meditation center, so they were free to do what they wanted, but they were not instructed to do some work or so. We just investigated them in the evening with the rating scales, but more or less they were free then to go to bed and sleep, because they had to go up very early. It's very challenging for the body to sit this 6-8 hours. It's very special.
I have a question right here.
I'm sorry, but we'll take 2 more questions.
Sorry, here in the middle. The question is somewhat tangential, but I am a professional DJ, so sort of musical guide, if you will. And you were speaking a little bit about music as well and the use that it has in the therapy. And I was wondering if you made any studies regarding the different kinds of musics, harmonies, rhythm, if it has any kind of effect and different response in the subjects.
Yes, we have started. We have done already studies looking the impact of music during LSD. And what we have done is everybody had to bring his own music. 10 songs they feel personally relevant. Also, not they like the song, but it's relevant. It's relevant for them because it was linked to some positive experience and getting a partner. I don't know what, a birthday or so. But it has to be relevant. And then the physicist cut down these songs and shuffled that kind of information. So it's the same physical stimulus, but doesn't make a lot of sense for them. And then they looked into the structure of this music. There's a whole company in Los Angeles we use doing these things. And they looked from the music pattern, similar songs, but they were also not relevant for the person. So we put them in a scanner and thought, the one that they are personally relevant, they may enlighten them, and other similar structures may be less stimulating. And we were interested what's going on in the brain. So yes, we have done that. And interestingly is that the ones they have known were personally relevant, LSD didn't enhance that experience. So that's what was an approach. We thought maybe we can even enhance something they really is important for them. It was the other way around, that the shuffled music, or how you say that, the scrambled music, was a complete surprise for them. So they were really attracted by new stuff, so not what they have known. And ones that were similar, they gave a little bit activation, more than in placebo. So we went deeper on, and with other music scientists, it's not our business, but we can do the experiment. They looked at harmonies, so the keys and all these things, what in Western music first. And then we could show that certain harmonies enhance regions that we know they are important for positive mood. There are harmonies that make you more sad, and there are harmonies they activate more. And they had worked on these patterns long because they study Alzheimer patients, and they found out that if you give Alzheimer patients certain harmonies, they start dancing. They were singing, they start dancing. And we thought, oh, this is interesting. There must be a question of harmony. Then we have looked at a rhythm structure, because I'm a drummer, so and all this percussion stuff. And this wasn't important. It's more the harmony, at least for emotion activation. And I think you have to go on with that. Now the next step is, because I could never warm up with kind of Japanese music, to see what's the difference for us, Western. I'm not a Japanese guy whom enlightened with that music. So that's a transcultural question of music harmonies. So certainly we can bring it to down to this very elementary, you are a DJ, musical patterns. I don't know what you, it would be interesting, what you would advise to look for.
Well, just as a suggestion, there's this book called Love Saves the Day by Tim Lawrence. I don't know if you know about it, about the sort of proto-disc at the beginning of these underground communities around LSD as well, with David Mancuso in New York.
Yes.
It's an interesting read. Thank you for your answer.
And our last question.
Yes. Oh, thanks. So it looked from some data you shared with us that there might be sort of a positive feedback between mindfulness practice or meditative practices and psychedelics assumption. And I was wondering if the meditators we work with had any thought about it, or if it's maybe just too, how may I put it, utilitaristic. So they're maybe out of this kind of pianification. And I was wondering regarding the benefits on attention and emotional regulation, if you think there could be some application for, I don't know, ADHD or I don't know, borderline, something like that.
ADHD I could imagine, but maybe lower doses. Borderline is tricky. Personality disorder is tricky to treat, but I know from Leiner and others who did that in the 80s and late 80s even. It needs a lot of sessions. The mean sessions that we can tease out of old studies is not that quality we have today, but at least followed up studies, catamnestic followed up. So we have an overview over 2 years of these patients that had needed about 10 to 12 LSD sessions in these German studies with 140 patients. As the personalities are really hard work, and you have to be dedicated and work with the patient. But apparently it's possible, but 12 sessions, my God, I don't know. It's work. The other thing is what we do with what we have done in our depression study. Instead of, we have rated, we had our inclusion criteria, but we had developed, we trained them 3 times before the psilocybin to do their mindfulness thing in the clinic. They got an app on the telephone. They do the body scanning, the breath regulation at home. So we can follow what they did 2 weeks long. It's not a long training. Then we did it before they got the psilocybin. They did mindfulness, the patients. Not everybody liked it. It was interesting. Some liked the breath work, some liked the body scanning, some worked other we had 5 different things they could select. So we don't do statistics about that, but at least, and then it goes on up to 5 weeks. So it would be nicer to do it 5 weeks before and then the psilocybin session. So to do a real study on the impact of that. But we use it, the mindfulness, to warm them up to look inside, because you cannot imagine that so many people, they have a hard problem to lay down and watch themselves. So they want to talk, or want to do this and that.
And another question is about, like in the movie, you picked meditators who had like really thousands and thousands of hours of meditation.
A few thousand, not thousands of that. Few
but yeah, and no, I wonder if you have any thoughts about. I mean, how do the benefits you have shown progress with time, with the, I mean, also the frequency, the accumulated hours, and also the constancy with which you keep up with the practice?
It's hard to say. I don't have the numbers in mind, but there was some influence of the number of hours on the experience, but it wasn't a predictor in the end. But how it develops in the future, I don't know. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank you again for your wonderful questions, insightful, thought-provoking, non-stop willing to ask question attitude. And that was beautiful and added a lot of richness to the event. So thank you so much for this. And thank you, Franz, for finishing with such a beautiful speech.